All right, we're live. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We'll give folks some time to get into the YouTube link and start joining us. I know some folks will be watching from LinkedIn as well. But as you're joining us today, if you have any questions, be sure to throw them into the chat. We'd love to, answer your questions. Probably towards the end of the presentation, because Tim will be going through quite a few different concepts here, and we don't want him to lose his train of thought. So I want to make sure we stay on time and give the space at the end for those questions. So, but before we kind of get started, I just want to go through some of the things for Startup Wisconsin Week, which this event is a part of. I want to give a big thank you to the sponsors that help make this possible across the state. Headway, Nicolay National Bank, New North, and Generator are really great partners for helping support what we do for the startup ecosystem and help support events like this one, as well as other events. There were 58 events across the state. Tim, if you want to go to the next slide, we can talk about Startup Wisconsin Week and how we do this every single year. So if you haven't participated in Startup Wisconsin Week and live in Wisconsin, be sure to check it out. Or maybe you're from Chicago and would like to come up for a day or two, go check it out. You can subscribe to our newsletter, learn about events that are coming up throughout the year as well, and as well as like the next Startup Week next year. I publish the newsletter every single month with events that are going on all across the state of Wisconsin, remote and in person. We aggregate and amplify what's going on in the ecosystem. So be sure to check that out. And thanks everyone for being here. All right, I'm going to jump into the chat and I'll hand things over to Tim, and he can take it from here.
All right. Well, thanks, Jacob. And thanks everybody for tuning in. So we're going to talk today. We're going to look at how we might be able to leverage MCP as a technology to bridge the design to development gap, right? So how can we automate some of the work that exists in moving design specification from a tool like Figma into project management software like Jira? So we're going to break down that conversation into three sections here. We're going to talk a little bit about design systems end to end. We're going to dig into how MCPs work, and then just take a little bit to wrap up, looking at some limitations around this approach, and then also looking ahead as best we can tell to what Figma and other tooling, other providers might offer in terms of tooling to solve this very problem. So before we dig into that further, though, just introduction for myself here. So I've been with Headway for a number of years as a development lead, been able to contribute across different clients and industries and technologies. Before joining Headway, I worked in higher education. My wife, Natalie, and I, we've got 5 kids, renovating an old family farmhouse. We love our church and we enjoy the outdoors. So a little bit about me on the personal side, but why don't we get back into this conversation of design system transfer of knowledge from one end to another. So when we talk about design systems, so a little bit of a groundwork here, there's many benefits that come with the design system. There are a couple challenges worth calling out, especially as we talk about agentic workflows. So first, like, there's benefits around communication, consistency, accessibility, maintainability, and speed. There are others as well. These have been well documented, but it's worth calling out. The communication benefits. A design system establishes a shared language and a single source of truth that can help accelerate efforts across an organization. So having a single source of truth and common language provides as a source of many benefits to contributors to product development. Consistency, right? There's having a single source of truth and common language by nature generates and produces consistent output, consistent products. That can help, prevent drift when it comes to overall organizational goals. So there's accessibility benefits to it, right? If we can define an accessible set of colors and interactions at the core of a product, at the core of an organization, well, it's much easier than to ship accessible products than to ship a product and then try to retrofit it to make it accessible, or to have separate product teams solve accessibility one after another. And so accessibility is a big benefit to a design system. Maintainability, there's many reasons why a design system can help make products more maintainable. But just one that I'd call out is the ability to look and evaluate a product and make sure, is it accurate, right? Being able to look at, is that thing that we're about to ship, is it true to the brand standard? Is it true to expectations for quality throughout our organization? And so that single definition helps that evaluation side of product development. And then speed, right? And not having to answer the same question over and over from one product team to another. By nature, that makes product development quicker. And so those are just a few benefits to call out. A couple challenges, though, like I mentioned, it's not all great. There are some new challenges that come with the design system. You got to be able to uphold those very norms that you establish. So you've got a core collection of truths, of decisions that have been made. You need to be able to make sure that those are upheld throughout an organization across products. And then agentic content, right? So this is sort of where we're going to focus in on today, is how do we solve getting design system context into an agent and leverage that agent then to produce and speed up product development. So, okay. All right, so we're going to talk, as the title suggests, we're going to talk specifically about writing user stories, getting definition from a design tool into a user story. That user story would then be something that an engineer would use to help implement the design spec. So why do we do that? Why do we write user stories? Well, just maybe calling out the obvious here, but right, user story allows us to track who's doing what. It helps us to plan and prioritize work. It helps us to communicate specifications, right, to the person that's doing the work. Here's exactly what's expected of you or of this feature or fix that's being represented by the story itself. So there are other reasons, but just high level, that's why we would write a user story and why we are using that as our topic of discussion today. So, okay, so then what might a well-written user story look like? Well, here's an example of one. Like, this is sort of the model user story that I will use as we go about evaluating different workflows using an agent to generate a user story. So you sort of think of user story as having three main parts. There's like the who, the what, and the when. There's that general statement. There's some acceptance criteria, and then I'll show some context and notes. But if you look at this example of a user story, right, I can see the who is just a general user, the when, like when they're signed in, right, and then the what. This story would help equip a user with quick access to main sections within a given app. And then acceptance criteria, the second section. So acceptance criteria, well, how do I know when this exercise is complete? What does done look like? And this helps me as an engineer. It might help QA in assessment. This helps define when the task itself is considered done and would be ready to be shipped. So those are the first two. Then the third one, and this is where we'll spend most of our time, is focusing in on like the context and the notes. So the overall statement, the who, the what, and the when, acceptance criteria, that doesn't call out design specification. So in this user story continued, I've got a screenshot on the left, and that is essentially what we're going to be building. And then I've got a sample implementation on the right in JSX. This would be example React code that we would write that would be the implementation for the screenshot on the left. And so the image on the right, why this is helpful is it's informed by the design system. So you'll see a couple aspects when you look more closely at that JSX. You're going to see a couple aspects that are unique to it. You're going to see not just generic HTML, but you're going to see specific design system component references. So things like a logo, a text component, menu item, icon, a container. Those things, again, they're not generic HTML. They're specific to our design system, and they're using language that our design system has established. So that's part of our ideal user story. That's one aspect. There's another aspect that I'll call out here, but we're not going to dig into too much because it's, in some ways, it's repetitive to the first point. The second part would be the class names, the styling of those individual elements. What's in the screenshot in this example JSX, these are just generic Tailwind classes. They're not design tokens. And so that element, that aspect of this effort can be achieved. But for our purposes today, we're just going to talk about component names at a high level. And you could extrapolate, like it implies that those the customization of those elements through class names, which would be specific to our design language in the form of a design token, that too can be achieved through this approach. So, okay, so how can we make our an agent, something like Claude Code, how can we make an agent generate a user story that matches this level of specification and fidelity, right? How can we make it aware of our design system, as this screenshot on the right illustrates? So I'm going to look at, we're going to kind of progress our way through 4 different approaches to this problem, right? So there's the traditional Figma-to-Jira. So I'm going to write this story. I'm going to look at the design specification in Figma. I'm going to identify what size an element is, what font is being used, what are the menu items specifically, what does that badge do? Like, I'm going to look in Figma, I'm going to identify what the design specification is, and then I'm going to type that out in the user story myself, and that's going to be what myself or somebody else works on to implement this sidebar. So there's some downsides to this. Obviously, it takes time to do that, right? It's not a lot of automation in that. It takes time, and then also how I write a user story is going to differ from my teammate a bit, and so there's consistency, which is one of the benefits of a design system. We lose some consistency just by nature of how we individually would write user stories. So, okay, so that's the first way. Not ideal. It does have the benefit, though, of it should give, in the end, an engineer every bit of information they need to accurately build out and implement the design that's being requested. So it can be accurate, but again, time consuming. Okay, so jumping into the next one. So let's try to add an agent to this workflow and see if we can't automate the process. So here we've got Figma with Claude being sent to Jira. Now, the prompt that I used here was just pretty generic, right? Just write a user story for the screenshot that I uploaded, and I instructed the agent, the story needs to guide a developer through an implementation using React and Tailwind. Be sure to include JSX in the generated story. So what Claude gave me with that singular prompt, but lacking any real context from the design system, you can see on the right, it's not visually, it's not at all accurate. There are elements from the screenshot. Pretty much every element is represented in that output, but again, it's generic. It's not styled correctly. It doesn't tie back to the design system really in any way. And so this is helpful. It speeds up the efforts compared to the first attempt, which would be manually transcribing that work, but it lacks a level of accuracy that we really need. So, okay, so let's jump on to the third one. So this one is actually similar to the previous, but there's an important variation to it. So previous one, I used Claude Desktop. This I'm using Claude Code. Doesn't matter per se because they're using the same underlying model in both examples. But the distinction here is in the prompt that I gave it, where I said, implement this design from Figma at, here's the address to my file. Okay, so that specific prompt is a clue to Claude to reach out to Figma's MCP Figma's own MCP server in order to get the context that it needs to complete the task. Now, in this example, I wasn't able to reach Figma's MCP, or rather Claude wasn't, because of an authorization issue. So sort of set that aside for a minute. So though it tried to get to Figma's MCP and get the context it needed, it failed because of an auth issue. However, it still walked me through, because it knew that this was a Figma file, and it knew that there is specification that it could get from Figma. Claude walked me through a series of questions, and then I answered those questions, and it actually gave me back a relatively accurate output. You can see on the right, it's not ideal, it's not perfect by any means, but it's much closer than the previous attempt, which was without any Figma awareness. It was just a one-shot attempt from Claude. And so, okay, so we're getting closer. Like, this is better, but this is still, it's still lacking design system context. It's still without reference to our design system UI kit. Good, but let's see if we can do better. And so now, if we replace the attempt and the awareness of Figma MCP with something like Shipwright MCP, we start to get much closer. In fact, we get like almost perfect in terms of the output. And so here's the difference. The Shipwright MCP has context that we didn't yet give to Figma's MCP, and I'll talk more about that in a upcoming slide. That's one important distinction. Again, I'll talk about that. The prompt that I gave this was more fleshed out as well, but the main difference between this prompt and the previous prompt is the ability to access Shipwright MCP, and then I specifically said, like, use Shipwright UI for this implementation. So you can see the output aesthetically looks correct. It looks right on, in fact. Now let's take a look more closely at the JSX that it generated. So here, again, from that same prompt, this JSX is closer to what I started with in our example user story. This has reference to our design system. There's a call out for an avatar, logo, text, a menu item, an icon, a container. Those elements come from our design system and have certain specification baked into them. And so I don't need Claude or any model, for that matter, any agent, to figure that stuff out on its own. It just needs to know that this is an avatar, and it needs to use the Shipwright UI avatar in order to achieve the design that's being requested. And so the Shipwright MCP exposes that information to the agent in a way that it can complete the task with a higher level of accuracy. So, okay, so this is much more promising. It's much closer to what we want, if not what we want. And I just want to call out one distinction here, because you might be thinking, well, I don't want to just create code. This is an exercise in generating a user story, right? So to come back to that, this is meant to help an engineer figure out what of a design system UI kit, what aspects of that do I need to complete this task. So it's different than saying, just take this code, copy and paste it, and then release it. It's meant to help guide them into, okay, you're going to need a logo, you're going to need an avatar, a text component. Here's generally how to arrange those things. So it helps accelerate an engineer's effort to implement this design by pointing them directly to the UI kit resources that they have available to use. So just want to point that out, just so there's not some confusion around, is this generating code for me, or is it writing a story? It's still writing a story. It's just giving a much more accurate and detailed story for you to work from. Okay, so let's move on to just how does an MCP work? talk a little bit about what an MCP is and how does it work. So we're using Claude Desktop and Claude Code for this presentation, but you could use many other MCP clients. VS Code would be a common one that folks would use, as engineering folks would use. So we're using Claude Desktop and Claude Code. On the MCP server side, we're using Shipwright MCP and Figma MCP, at least in concept. And those are our MCP servers. So in MCP server, there's two different transport protocols, two different ways to connect an MCP client with the server. You can use standard IO, or you can use streamable HTTP. Standard IO would be more for something that's running locally as an MCP server that your agent would talk to. HTTP obviously would be something that was hosted that your client would want to reach out to over the wire form. And then there's three utilities that an MCP server, the protocol itself, defines. So there's tools, resources, and prompts. Tools can perform a function. They take in an argument, they do work for you, and then they give you back the output from that work. A resource you can think of as more of a static element, static document, something that is read-only, that would help an agent get enough context for it to complete the task that's being asked of it. And then a prompt would be something like I showed initially in the Claude plus Figma MCP-to-Jira workflow. Prompt would be implement this design at my Figma URL. That becomes a prompt that then clues the agent into using a specific aspect or feature of an MCP server. And then that server can take that prompt, break it apart, extract the parts that are meaningful, and perform work accordingly. So, okay, so that's a brief overview on how MCP work, what the definition is for the protocol itself. A little bit more, again, we're stepping outside of the Figma-to-Jira with MCP workflow into more general MCP discussion here. So my agent, to reiterate, my agent can then talk to a server. I might call on something like GitHub's list repo tool, GitHub's MCP server, their list repo tool. That would give me back a list of repos that I would have access to, for example. Or my database might have an MCP server that would allow me to query data within that database, again, through just a common language that the server would recognize and the agent would trigger. So because there's that ability to build your own MCP server or to use somebody else's MCP server, there's a layer separated from the agent that allows you to really do anything, which is illustrated by this bottom row here, right? I can have the agent reach out to my calendaring system. I could have it reach out to Slack or Notion. It could do the sky's the limit, right? It could do anything really for you as long as you can clue your agent into when to trigger those different tools, resources, and prompts. Okay, so let's get back then, that overview, that little bit of a sidebar, into what Shipwright MCP does for us specifically. So in this case, there's two tools that help us get the output that I showed a couple slides ago. List components and then get component details. So when I ask the agent, hey, write a user story for me for this design and use the Shipwright UI to achieve that design, it has these two tools at its disposal: list components, get component details. So list components would give you back a list of components that Shipwright UI provides, and then get component details help the agent figure out, okay, I need a menu item here. Shipwright UI gives me menu item component. Now, what are the props for that? Well, get component details allows the agent to know what the typing is and what the props are in order to build out, at least suggest what might be a proper implementation given the original design specification. So it doesn't take much to achieve a really accurate result from an MCP agent. Okay, then here's, just to further illustrate, like here's an example of with and without MCP, right? So without that shipwright MCP, without that context, agent's going to do its best, and it's going to say, well, it looks like I need a button, maybe for the menu item, or maybe for the bottom current user section of that sidebar design. It's going to assume an on-click. It's going to assume class name, disabled, enabled states. That's all true, but it's disconnected from our design system. The second picture on the right shows us one that is informed by the MCP, right? It has a button with a variant and a size, and then also on-click and disabled, right? So there's specifics for our design system that help, me as an engineer picking up this user story that this snippet would be borrowed from. It helps me to achieve that design much more quickly than had I started from scratch or only looked at Figma for design specification. Okay, so let's just take a look a little bit at some limitations and future, what do we anticipate this becoming, and what might be some challenges in the future. So limitations, challenges. There's an LLM is non-deterministic, right? So if our design system, one of the benefits, one of the values of a design system is that it's consistent, that it's speedy to work with. If I have output that's different given the same input from day to day, that challenges the benefits that I get from my design system, right? I want to be able to know that if I give this specific Figma URL to a specific frame and design specification to my agent, that I'm going to get back basically the same output as I did yesterday, assuming the design specification is the same today. That's challenging, right? Again, if the LLM is not going to promise to give me back the same thing. So that's one of the things that the MCP helps to minimize. It helps to lessen the drift that happens in responses to the same input. Permissions. So just briefly, if I've got another tool that is accessing remote resources or local resources, there's some permission challenges that we have to sort out with an MCP server like this. And that assumes that you've already worked through organizationally permissions around using the agent that you prefer, something like Claude or any agent within VS Code. So now that this is yet one other piece that needs the right permissions from an organizational perspective, not impossible, but just need to call out that as a challenge, a hurdle to overcome. And then perception, sort of like I had mentioned a few minutes ago, in terms of the user story, the context and notes that are added at the bottom of that user story in the form of JSX is not meant to, again, it's not meant to be copy and paste and then ship. It's meant to be like, this is what you likely will need to complete the activity. It'll help speed up what otherwise is a research step within the process of completing the ticket. And so it's an aid to the engineer. It's not meant to replace or whatever. It's meant to help accelerate their workflow and make things more accurate for them in the end. So perception is a bit of a challenge, but one that we're all working through as these tools begin to mature and evolve. All right, so let's look a little bit at the future, because Figma is continually improving their own offerings and tooling within Figma itself. And this is true of other design tools, but Figma is certainly the one that we use and prefer with Headway. One of those tools that they've been recently announced and been improving is their Code Connect tool. So Code Connect, in the end, what it does is it will provide a design system informed code snippet, again, which is one of our objectives, right? Is our main objective in our user story. How do we write that design system informed code snippet? So it certainly accelerates that process by matching the design in Figma with your UI kit. And then once it does that, what you can see on screen here in this picture from Figma's site is there's actually a playground, so you can begin to interact with the component definition and see the output and the JSX that would accompany that mix of properties and settings. You can see it right there, and so it's quick to and almost no cost to the engineer to be able to tinker with a design and experiment with it before having to take it into the code base and implement themselves there. So, so it's really good. So what's the I guess the downside of this? We'll get to that in a minute. The other big announcement, amongst others as well, is Figma's MCP server, like I've already mentioned. So over the summer, this was announced. It was made available in beta form. I believe recently it left the beta. It was open beta. I believe that label's been removed from it. Now, if you, let's see. So if you looked at our first attempt at writing user story with just a prompt and a screenshot, like the model did its best to derive design specs and generate valid code, but it just didn't have enough context to deliver on what we needed, right? It took time for the model to generate that poor result too. So it wasn't like, oh, we tried it, that's not accurate, let's try something else, because it takes time and it takes resources to get to that inaccurate result. So we don't want to continue to spend cycles trying things only to know that it's not what we need in the end. Figma's MCP is promising to solve that, right? As we've shown with Shipwright MCP, it's promising to do something similar in that it's taking information from Code Connect, from the design spec in the design tool itself, and exposing that to the engineering side, to the programmer side. When that is very promising. That's a good thing, right? So there's sort of a round trip. Design in Figma, develop UI kit that is informed by the specification in your component library in Figma. Design UI kit. Now bring that information from your UI kit back into Figma so that Figma's own MCP can inform an agent of what the component API is in order to implement the design that's being requested. So there's a lot of layers to it. Let me actually stay there for a minute. The challenge with that is, one of them is the round trip that it takes to come back from your UI kit back into Figma's own Code Connect. There's ongoing cost with that. There's ongoing maintenance because you need to tell Figma what that UI kit implementation is. What are the props? What are the components? What is the definition to that UI kit component that Figma then can use to help an agent, again, answer questions that it's asked. So why would I guess, so the question then would be, why would I use Shipwright or any design system MCP and not Figma's own MCP server? Well, kind of like I just started to say, there's a cost in trying to keep Figma's Code Connect up to date with your UI kit. Second part is there's another, like, dollars and cents. There's an expense because in order to use Figma's MCP, you need a dev or full seat within Figma's org. So there's cost that you need to pay to have access to that utility within Figma. And then in the early testing, actually in the output from what we've been seeing when comparing something like a design system MCP, Shipwright MCP in this case, or Figma's MCP, the output actually isn't better or worse in either one. It's just that the Shipwright MCP doesn't have any added cost or maintenance to it. I can have that MCP look at my UI kit and provide the context that my agent needs without having to come full circle back into Figma with more code, teaching Figma how my UI kit is defined so that it can then feed the agent the context it needs to do the work. And so that it's early testing. There's more to come, and Figma, of course, is improving their MCP and their Code Connect offering. But at this point, we're getting really accurate results from a local MCP that's based on our own design system. And so that's why we have been exploring further after some initial testing, why we're exploring further local MCP over relying more and more on Figma for these types of tools. So the beauty of this too is that I can replace the underlying UI kit. It might be Shipwright UI one day, or another project might call for a different UI kit, MUI or you name it, right? It could be any other UI kit, because the UI kit MCP is looking at those packages on its own and it's deriving the context it needs. I don't need to do new work if I were to move to different UI kit in Figma. I don't need to reconnect with Code Connect. I don't have to reinform Figma of those changes. I can, this approach with a design system MCP allows me to apply it to any other UI kit besides something like Shipwright UI. So it's more portable in a sense, and a little bit more future-proof. So with that, can move into some Q&A.
All right. I've been asking in the chat if anybody has any questions. Nothing has showed up yet. So while we're waiting for any last minute questions that may come in, we'll give folks a minute or two to reflect on what they what you went through today and see what they have. I do have questions around just like what it's been like to work with teams around this kind of stuff and like implementing it that way. And if there's a little bit of like a learning curve around it, because you seem to be the most in the weeds with it, and how you've kind of been like going around or going about teaching people about like what you've been learning and like how it could be implemented, and when does it make sense to implement this thing when they may already have something in place. Or like I think about what we do at Headway, and we kind of have a process, but when does it make sense for like us to change the process?
Yeah, I think it as from a developer's perspective, as my workflow is changing to be more agentic, right? There's more reliance on AI, and there's good reasons for that. It's quicker, right? There could be a higher level of accuracy. It helps in a lot of different ways. That's the experience that more and more that others are having, right? And so how do we make sure that the expectations of those workflows, like how do we measure their effectiveness? And then, what do we expect from them, so that I can help somebody else onboard and say, well, here's what you're going to get from this. Here's something tangible that you're going to get from this workflow. Something like an MCP server that's informed by a design system that's custom to your organizational language. Well, that's tangible, right? Like that's something that I can help you see that when you use this, here's going to be the result. And it doesn't come at any additional cost to you, right? Like I can help you get it set up once, and then you can use it and benefit from it.
Yeah. From front to back, how much time do you feel like it would take to implement,
to connect your agent to an MCP server?
Yeah, like let's just say like, hey, you're coming to a team, and you're gonna connect up the MCP server with their existing design system so they can leverage that. Like what would the duration of that be?
Well, getting the MCP server itself, let's say this is already defined, right? So if you're using something like Shipwright MCP, you
Hmm.
simply need a copy of that. You need to configure your agent to talk then and to use that MCP server, that code that's now on your machine, and that's it. And so configuring your MCP server, configuring an agent is fairly simple. It's some maybe 10 lines of JSON. It's telling it where that MCP server either is running or where it's found on your file system, giving it permission if it needs permission, and then your agent should just work from there. So,
Hmm.
so it's a 10-minute conversation with somebody on a phone call to get that set up and configured, and then they can use it and benefit from it.
Wow, that's a lot faster than I was anticipating. So
It's
that's
yeah, it's
awesome.
pretty quick. Whereas that's again this one other thing with something like a Figma MCP where you need to make sure you have the right permissions within the Figma org. Um, you still need to do the same setup, but there's at least one additional step in that
Hmm.
choice.
All right, cool. Well, I see there's still some folks hanging out. I don't see any questions though coming in through the stream here or through the chat. So this is your last chance as we wrap things up. Um, Hopefully everyone learned something today, and I appreciate you, Tim, for taking the time to unpack like all your learning and put it together into this presentation. I know you're a busy guy, so I really, really appreciate it. And I look forward to also just learning more about like what we're doing between design and development. Um, like you said too, it's like with all these tools, like the quality of our work can start to improve, not just the volume. Like it's more about like effectiveness, as a team member, and how we're all working together and how we can get these systems to collaborate more effectively. So it's all good stuff. Um, so yeah, thanks again, Tim. Is there anything else you want to share as we kind of wrap things up here?
No, that's great. I appreciate everybody joining in, and you can always find us online if questions come up after the fact.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So if you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Check out what's if there's anything else coming up soon. I know we'll be planning some more live streams like this in the near future, which would be great. Some more content on the YouTube channel. And if you're watching the recording of this, be sure to ask your questions in the comments, and we'll do our best to follow up. And obviously, with anything, this presentation may become inaccurate in 3 to 6 months. As the technologies keep kind of coming out and the capabilities of these tools keep happening and changing. And I think that's the thing we're trying to do, is just have that dialogue around like, hey, here's a new thing. It sounds really great in practice or like in theory, but in the real world, this is how we're experiencing it. And I think that's kind of the point of our YouTube channel, is like actually sharing in when these tools or processes are done in practice in real teams and real environments. Like these are the results you can get or will get, and things you should think about. So yeah, thanks again to Tim for hosting today's discussion, and everybody take care and have a great weekend.